Thank you for watching this teaching video from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. Please subscribe to our channel and check out our other videos. Our mission is to help people come to know Jesus better and love Him more every day. We believe that this will not only help our own spiritual growth, but also help us better influence our communities and world for Christ. For more information about Oak Tree, please visit our website at oaktreechurch.com, where you'll find past message series, online giving options, and more information about our discipleship process we call The Path. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or through our website contact form. Now, please enjoy this message.
Well, we are working our way through the book of Zechariah. Not a place that we tend to spend a lot of time on a regular basis. The church we don't find in the Old Testament at all, not prophesied, not in existence. The church did not come into existence until Acts chapter 2. And so the great majority of the teaching about the church, to the church, for the church, of course, is in the New Testament. And a little bit in the Gospels, Jesus sort of dropped some breadcrumbs along the way, but really it starts after Acts 2. And so when we come to the Old Testament, we need to make sure that, number one, we're not inserting ourselves into the story, and yet at the same time not looking at it like, okay, well, I guess we haven't been in the Old Testament for a while, so we should probably do this just to balance it out, and then we can get back to the good stuff, right? We don't want to come with that attitude either. There is stuff that we are to learn. There are things that we are to learn. And just a reminder that when we study the Bible and we come to application, the application of the Scriptures, the text, should be the last step. Right? We don't want to open the text and sort of close our eyes and point a finger down there and just say, okay, read the verse. What am I supposed to do about it? We want to make sure that we're doing good Bible study, solid Bible study, and sometimes that means jumping all over the place in order to understand what we're talking about right now. That's sort of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen this morning, just to let you know. Because in order to understand our passage at the last half of Zechariah 6, we are going to have to jump around a little bit and let Scripture interpret itself so that we don't fall into the trap of just making stuff up, right? We don't want to make it up. We don't want to insert ourselves. And then we do, after we've done our work and what does it say, then we can say, okay, well, what does that mean? What's the meaning of it? What are the things that we're supposed to glean from this? And then we can work on application and say, all right, what are we supposed to know moving forward? And if there's anything, what are we supposed to do? And that's why we, in our normal, regular, weekly study here in our service, we work through the passage, we make some comments along the way, and then we end with a few application questions. What should we know or do about this? Well, today is, this whole thing so far has been a lot of prophecy. We'll have to review a little bit, and we will have to, like I said, jump around a little bit to make sure that we get the proper interpretation, the proper meaning. And then the big question at the end is going to be, so what? Because this is not about us, especially in this passage directly. So what should we be learning from this? What should we be thinking about this? So that just gives you an idea of where we're headed this morning. Our passage this morning is Zechariah chapter 6, and we're going to look at the second half, so verses 9 through 15. And I'm just going to read this straight through and then come back and break it down a little bit because it sort of needs to be read as a set. So Zechariah chapter 6, verse 9, the word of the Lord came to me as follows. Choose some people from among the exiles, namely Heldai, Tobiah, Jedaiah, all of whom have come from Babylon. And when you have done so, go to the house of Josiah, son of Zephaniah, There's a whole bunch of names we're going to have to take care of, just to let you know. Then take some of the silver and gold to make a crown and set it on the head of Joshua, son of Jehozadak. So there's another name that we have to deal with. And then say to the high priest, and then say to him, the Lord who rules over all says, look, here is a man whose name is Branch. So now we've got another name that we have to deal with. There's a lot of names. Who will sprout up from his place and build the temple of the Lord. Indeed, he will build the temple of the Lord and will be clothed in splendor, sitting as a king upon his throne. Moreover, there will be a priest with him on his throne, and they will see eye to eye on everything. The crown will then be turned over to Helem, to Tobiah, Jedaiah, and Hain, the son of Zephaniah, as a memorial in the temple of the Lord. Then those who are far away will come and build the temple of the Lord, so that you may know that the Lord who rules over all has sent me to you. This will all come to pass if you completely obey the voice of the Lord your God. There's a lot of stuff in there. It's packed. It doesn't maybe seem like it. It's only a handful of verses. But it's packed with names. It's packed with references. It's packed with this concept of the temple and building the temple. And he's going to build the temple. And then they're going to build the temple. And there's a memorial in the temple. And it's just like, what are we supposed to do with all of this? Well, let's break it down. The theme of this passage really comes back to this. It's a follow-up prophecy to the visions, okay? And the theme is the crowning of the king after the coming or the future judgments are over, okay? That's where the whole passage is going. And then this morning we'll unpack that and see how I got to that conclusion. The theme is the coming of the king, the crowning of the king, and after the coming judgments are over. Now, I call this a follow-up prophecy. Here's why. We are done with the 8 visions. Okay, starting in just a few verses into chapter 1, Zechariah either didn't go to bed one night, or God woke him up and said, we've got a busy night planned. Okay, and he said, I didn't know we had a busy night planned. God said, well, I didn't tell you ahead of time. I'm going to give you some visions. It reminds me of a Christmas carol, right? Jacob Marley comes to Scrooge and says, you're going to be visited by 3 spirits tonight, right? And he was surprised, they did it in one evening, one night. Well, in Zechariah, he had 8 different visions. And if we just take them one at a time, it looks like they're not connected at all. It looks like they're just sort of this hit and miss. There's some weird stuff in there. Remember, there's a flying scroll. There's a basket with a woman in it. There's horses and chariots. And it's just like, what's going on? This part right here, starting in verse 9, is no longer part of the visions. Okay? Zechariah is awake. It's not a vision. It's not a dream. He is awake. This is probably the next day, the next morning. There's no more interpreting angel in here as we have gone through the visions. Remember, Zechariah would sometimes ask, there's an angel nearby, so what's going on here? What's going on? And an angel would be interpreting. There's no interpreting angel for him. There's no explanation from an angel. This is Zechariah talking directly, God talking directly to Zechariah. He's just listening. He's not talking, right? God says, here is my message, direct revelation, direct message from God to the prophet with a specific task for him to do based on that message. And that's really the nature of prophecy. Prophecy is not just, I think I heard a word from God. I think I've got a message from God. I had this dream and this was a wonderful thing. Whatever people will claim prophecy today. That's not prophecy. By definition, prophecy is direct revelation from God to a person for the explicit purpose of sharing with one or more other people. Okay? So just preaching is not prophecy. Not all prophecy is about the future. Some prophecy was a direct message to a person about something going on right there in that time. This is both what we call a near and a far prophecy. Zechariah was supposed to do something that day or within a couple of days right there that is going to set up what is going to come in the future. And in fact, he says, when that happens, you'll know that this was all a part of the overall plan and that I was and am a true messenger of God. And so we've got this what I'm calling a follow-up prophecy. Now that the visions are done, what are we supposed to do with this? What is Zechariah supposed to do with this? Here's what he is supposed to do. The word of the Lord, verse 9, the word of the Lord came to me. And this is what the word of the Lord said. Now, this phrase, the word of the Lord, is used in Zechariah, the book of Zechariah, to introduce a new message or to distinguish one message from each other. I just put a list here in my notes. In chapter 1, verse 1, it's a message to the Jews who have returned. In chapter 1, verse 7, it introduces the whole set of visions. But even in the middle of the visions, in chapter 4, within the fifth vision, God sort of broke from the vision just a little bit to say, here's a special message within even the broader vision. And so this phrase, the word of the Lord, in Zechariah is specifically intended to say, here is a package of something that I want to make sure you know and you do something about. Here it concludes the visions. It starts a message that finishes the visions. In chapter 7, we have a message, a package. In chapter 8, we have another message package that we'll see over the next few weeks. And then it's really interesting that the final 6 chapters, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, are broken into 2 sections. 9 through 11, 12 through 14. And this phrase, the word of the Lord, begins chapter 9, ends chapter 11. It's sort of like bookends on that message. See, these are visual clues in the text to help us see how the narrative is flowing, how the messages are flowing. Not every passage is like that, right? But when we do come to books like Zechariah, when we come to passages where there are these little clues, I like to point them out because it's good for us to know. And then chapter 12, verse 1 says the word of the Lord again, and it finishes the rest of the book. And so we've got these sort of set up along the way. So the word of the Lord came to me as follows, and the rest of this passage, verses 12 through 15, is what God said to Zechariah. Verse 10, choose some people from among the exiles. These are people who have come back to Babylon, and they're going to have some silver and gold. These are probably things that were brought back from Babylon, Persia, Babylon, for the specific purpose of rebuilding the temple. Remember, the whole context here is that a man by the name of Zerubbabel brought back from Babylon, from Persia, about 50,000 people to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem so that Israel could start their worship of God again. And they brought back silver and gold and wood and all sorts of things to be able to rebuild this. And God is going to say here, take some of that and use it for a different purpose. Now, if you were on the receiving end of this, not just Zechariah, but the people, right? The priests, all of these guys, we'll take a look, all of these guys are priests. And Zechariah shows up and says, hey, you know some of that money that was dedicated, that was contributed, donated, so that we could build the temple? I want you to do something else with it. I want you to divert that money into another project. How would you feel about that? Come on, you can say it. Be like, are you sure you got this message from God? Are you sure? You had a long night, Zechariah, you know? Are you sure you're listening correctly? This money was donated for a specific purpose. It's about bringing the temple back so we can worship God. And you're telling us that God said, don't use it for that, use it for something else, which seems completely unrelated. And you're telling us, we who are priests, to divert this money elsewhere. Under the law in the Old Testament, the priests were given very specific instructions about what they could and could not do with contributions. Isn't this, to use a modern term, wouldn't this be considered fraud? Private jet, nice car, whatever. If we just divert the money, it's for ministry, right? It's for ministry. We see this all the time today with people, with leaders, religious leaders, church leaders doing stuff like that, right? And unfortunately, that gives Christianity a bad name, because I don't know if you've priced these jets recently. I have, just to make sure that they're not within the budget. And they're not. They're nowhere close to the budget, right? Private jets and really nice cars and expensive houses and stuff. Now, I'm going to rabbit trail for just a second. I'm letting you know this ahead of time. There are some of these people out here, men and women, who are, very well known, very influential, and they have nice things, right? There's nothing wrong with having nice things. Absolutely nothing in the Bible that says we can't have nice things, that we cannot buy expensive things. Well, yeah, but they're doing it off of the backs of the people who are giving to their churches or whatever. Interestingly, in many cases, that's not true. In many cases, they have written books, they've published materials under their own name, and this is actually paycheck, royalties and stuff that they have earned for their books. And if they want to go buy a nice car, they want to buy a nice house with the money that they've earned by writing books and by, doing that type of thing, and it's not, the church is not paying for whatever, what do I care? I don't care. So I'm just letting you know when I show up with a really, my books don't sell that well, not like some of these people. But it's true, by the way. It really is true. Some of these people who have these well-known people, names that I'm sure you would recognize, most of their money, in many cases, they don't even take a paycheck from the churches where they work or the ministries where they work, because they make so much money from their other their book sales and everything. So be careful, just be careful in judging other people by what they look like. How did we get on that? I don't remember. Oh yeah, diverting funds. Diverting funds, right? They're not in many cases, sometimes they are, but in many cases they're not diverting funds from the ministry. But here Zechariah said, I want you to take some of this stuff. It was donated to the temple fund, and I want you to use it for non-temple purposes. And so you can see that they may already be a little bit iffy about what's going on here. And I think that's why, and I could be completely wrong here, but I think that's why God listed some of these names. God listed these people in here very specifically, very detailed, so that we would know, looking back at this, that when God lays out a plan, in many cases He gives a lot of detail. At least in the Old Testament He did. He gave a lot of detail because He needed them to know, yes, I am behind this. This is not just Zechariah making this up. This is not just Moses making this up. This is really what I want you to do, especially as God's working with the nation of Israel. And so he gives these names: Heldai, Tobijah, Jediah. They've come from Babylon, and it seems like they are maybe they're staying at the house of Josiah there, son of Zephaniah. Now, a couple of things. Do I have a slide for this? I do. So Heldai he's mentioned only. This is the only time I can find him in Scripture. Okay, so I don't really know anything else about him. Tobijah shows up here, and then a few verses later in verse 14. But he also shows up in 2 Chronicles. The problem with showing up in 2 Chronicles 17 is that was 100 some odd years ago, from Zechariah to 2 Chronicles. So we're not talking about the same guy, just the same name. Okay, that's the problem with some of these names. Jediah here, also in verse 10 here, verse 14, and several times he's mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah were at this time. So when we see him in Ezra and Nehemiah, we're talking about the same guy. Josiah. Josiah was king in Second Chronicles. He was the great-great-grandson of King Hezekiah, and he was king. He reigned and he died before the captivity. So we're still talking almost 100 years ago from King Josiah. So it can't be the same guy who's living here in Jerusalem. We're told that he is the son or descendant, some kind of Zephaniah. Now, same thing. Zephaniah the prophet lived, about 100 years ago. So what's with all these names? Well, what we find is that Zechariah, our prophet here, is both a prophet and a priest, comes from a priestly line. We find that if this is the same Zephaniah, or the same line of Zephaniah, the prophet, then this is also a priestly line. Okay? We're talking about priests here. These are not civil leaders, these are the religious leaders. This is a religious-based event or issue that God is doing. This is not a civil thing. This is not about ruling class. This is not about kings. He's going to mention a king here, and we'll have to see why that works. But he has not invited Zerubbabel, who's the governor, into this. He's not invited the elders of Israel, as far as we know, into this. This is a very small, private group of priests who are either active or just part of the priestly line. So that sets the tone for what's about to happen. This is all about religious service here in Zechariah. By the way, a couple of these names, I don't remember what Heldai's name means, but Tobijah means Jehovah is good. And Jediah means that God knows. God knows. And so in His goodness and in His knowledge, I think there's maybe a play on words here, maybe not. Maybe God chose these people specifically. But all of these names, or at least a couple of these names, have this characteristic of God. When we get down to verse 14, we find that Josiah is called Chain. Right here. Okay? He's called Chain, the son of Zephaniah. The word Chain in Hebrew means grace or gracious. And so we've got Josiah is called like the gracious one. So all of these names have a little something behind them that show maybe what's going on in this context. So here's what they're supposed to do. You're supposed to, verse 11, take some silver and some gold and redirect it from temple ministry, and you're supposed to make a crown and set it on the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. So Joshua is the high. We've run into him before in a couple of previous visions. We've run into Joshua. He is the religious leader of Israel at this time, the high priest in Israel. Zerubbabel is the governor of Israel. So we've got the civil and the religious, but the civil's off to the side for now, just Joshua. And here's what's interesting. Not once in Israel's history for almost 1,000 years, since it's been 900 years since they've been released from Egypt. Okay, with Moses and that Joshua, 900 years ago Joshua. And of course, we do the same thing. We name our kids after family members. We name our kids after important people. Of course, they're doing the same thing. So it's been 900 years since they've been released from Egypt. And for 900 years, not once has God commanded to crown a priest and a king as the same person. Never. The priest and the king, the priest and the civil leaders were always supposed to be separate once they got to the point where they had kings. God never blended the two of them together. And so, one time, one king tried to do it, Uzziah. He crowned himself as the priest, and that did not make God happy in any way. God really took care of him for that. In fact, and so that shows us that that's not the way it was supposed to be. And yet here we have God saying, I've got Joshua the high priest here. I want you to make a crown and put it on his head. Why? And then say, verse 12, say to him, look, here's a man whose name is Branch, who sprout up from his place and build the temple of the Lord. Again, if we go back just a couple of visions, we find that Zerubbabel is going to, let's go back to chapter 4, Zerubbabel is going to build the temple. If you go to chapter 4, verse, let's say 8, because that's one of our word of the Lord's. We're in vision 5. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me. The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple, and his hands will complete it. Seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Zerubbabel started it, the civil leader, the governor, and he will finish it. And now we come to chapter 6, and we say, hold on a second. Verse 12, the Lord who rules over all says, look, here's a man whose name is Branch, who will sprout up from his place and build the temple of the Lord. I thought you said Zerubbabel was going to do it. I did. But now Branch, Joshua is going to do it? Hold on a second. What's our interpretation? This is where we really get to the meat of things. We need to go back to chapter 3 here in Zechariah. And this is what's going to tell us what's going on. Dale taught this a few weeks ago, and we need to go down to verse 7. Chapter 3, verse 7. The Lord who rules over all says, if you live and work according to my requirements, you'll be able to preside over my temple and attend to my courtyards, and I'll allow you to come and go among these others who are standing by you. Now, this is to Joshua. Look at verse 8. Listen now, Joshua, the high priest. Same guy as we're talking about in chapter 6. Both you and your colleagues who are sitting before you, all of you are what? A symbol. All of you, Joshua and these people, all of you are a symbol that I am about to introduce my servant, the Branch. So, when we get to chapter 6, and God says, put the crown on Joshua's head, here is a man who's going to shoot up and build the temple, and his name is Branch, is that Joshua? No. Joshua is the stand-in. Joshua is the fill-in. Joshua is the symbol. He is the man standing in front of Zechariah that is going to get the crown put on his head, but he is not the branch. God has already told us he's not the branch. God has already said you are standing in for the branch at this time, but I'm actually talking about someone else. See how easy prophecy is? We let it interpret itself, and we don't get into trouble. Now, we keep going down and we find out, when is this going to happen? Verses 9 and 10. As for the stone that I set before Joshua, this is that weird 7 eyes on one stone. There are 7 eyes that we figured out later. I'm about to engrave an inscription on it. It says, the Lord who rules over all, to the effect that I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. At what point in history has all of the sin of Israel, all of the iniquity, all of the guilt of Israel been completely removed from the nation? Has that ever happened? Not yet. Not yet. And we have the hindsight of thousands of years of history. We can go back to Jesus, even on the cross. There are still sinners right there. Literally sinners right there at the foot of the cross. The guilt, the sin has not yet been removed from Israel, especially as a nation. It hasn't happened yet. It wasn't happened at Jesus' time. You go back the 500 years to Zechariah. It hasn't happened at that point. We're still waiting for this to happen. And we come to verse 10. In that day, says the Lord who rules over all, everyone will invite his friend to fellowship under his vine and under his fig tree. That day is a phrase that shows up some 50 times in the book of Zechariah, and in every case it refers to the coming kingdom. Okay? There are principles, there are things that, were they able to invite their friend to fellowship under their vine and fig tree at other times? Yes, absolutely. There's been peace in Israel. There's been non-peace in Israel. In fact, we come to John chapter 1, and Philip is hunting for his friend Nathanael to say, hey, we found the Messiah. And where do we find Nathanael? Sitting under, I think it's a fig tree, if I remember right. Could be wrong, but I think it's a fig tree in John chapter 1. So even if it's not, he's still sitting there peacefully talking to each other about the Messiah. And so there are other times in history where we could say, yeah, look at that. They've been able to do that. But the phrase "in that day" ties all this together. There is a time coming. Remember, the theme of this passage in chapter 6 is the crowning of the king after the coming judgments. There is a time coming where God will finally remove all of the guilt, all the iniquity, all of the sin from Israel, from the land itself even, and there will be perfect peace and perfect harmony. We call this the Messianic or the Millennial Kingdom, Messiah's kingdom, the 1,000-year reign before we go into eternity. In chapters 1 through 8, just something interesting. In chapters 1 through 8, this is the only time that we find the phrase "that day." This exact phrase, "that day," looking to the future. In chapter 9, we find it one more time. We're starting to build up to it. But in chapters 12 through 14, we find it all over the place. Because in chapters 12 through 14, the theme is the coming kingdom. And when we get to those chapters, we'll see this is what Messiah's kingdom is going to be like, getting into it and then in it. So we have lots and lots of times there. That day is a phrase in Zechariah. It's used a lot for that purpose. So, make sure I'm following along here. Who or what is the branch? According to Zechariah chapter 3, Joshua is standing as a symbol of this coming branch. Now here's what's interesting. I've got these other passages up here for you. We have to go to the book of Isaiah, chapter 4, and depending on your translation, this one's actually a little weird, the way the net does it. Chapter 4, verse 2, at that time the crops given by the Lord will bring admiration and honor. Some translations put branch instead of crops there. So it's a little bit difficult to tell, are we just talking about regular crops, or are we talking about the servant of God? Hard to tell. You know what's not hard to tell? Is Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah 11 is actually really cool. A shoot will grow out of Jesse's rootstock. Who's Jesse? Anybody remember? David's father, David's dad. By the time we get from, David was the great king, lots of money, lots of wealth, that whole thing. By the time we get from David to Jesus in David's family tree, the family of David is broke. No money. To the point that when Joseph and Mary came to circumcise Jesus and present their offering after Jesus was born, they had to use the alternate offering option. Okay, there was the law said when you come to present your son and circumcision and purify the wife and all of those things, you have to bring a very specific sacrifice. And it could be a bull or a ram or a goat or a sheep, all of the whatever the law stated for each sacrifice. But if you could not afford these things, you can bring 2 turtle doves. And we come to Luke chapter 4, or Luke chapter 3 rather, and you know what Joseph and Mary brought with them to the temple? 2 turtle doves. They could not even afford the regular animal for the sacrifice. That's how poor they were. And it's a great principle. God never set the law up to break his people. It's not, to bankrupt his people. That's not why he did that. So he offered these different options. They brought 2 turtle doves, which also proves that the Magi, the wise men, came after that. right? Because by the time the Magi, the wise men came, they had lots of stuff as they're bringing gold and frankincense and myrrh and the other things, right? They would have been able to afford one of those animals, but they couldn't right at the beginning. And so they brought these little turtle doves. So we've got David, almost the epitome of wealth, David and Solomon, the epitome of wealth in the kingdom of Israel. And when the true Messiah finally comes, they have nothing. That's how far the family of David had fallen to that point. And so Jesse, who was a rancher, a farmer, the shoot is going to grow not just out of David, but actually out of Jesse's rootstock. A bud will sprout from his roots, and this is how he's described. The Lord's Spirit will rest on him. A spirit that gives extraordinary wisdom. A spirit that provides the ability to execute plans. A spirit that produces absolute loyalty to the Lord. He will delight in obeying the Lord. He will not judge by mere appearances or make decisions on the basis of hearsay. He'll treat the poor fairly and make right decisions for the downtrodden of the earth. He'll strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and order the wicked to be executed. Justice will be like a belt around his waist. Integrity will be like a belt around his hips. There are people who are crying for justice and human rights and the treating of the poor and all of this stuff in many nations around the world, including ours here. And it's never, ever going to happen perfectly until the Anointed One, the Messiah, the branch that comes out of David's family tree, finally is ruling this world. If we go over to chapter 53, a well-known chapter, we sort of miss this first part. Chapter 53, verse 1, who would have believed what we just heard, our report? Maybe your translation says, when the Lord's power was revealed through him, he sprouted up like a twig. There's our branch. He sprouted up like a twig before God, like a root out of parched soil. We have this dry, what looks to be dead family tree. Nobody's been ruling on the throne of David for hundreds of years. But God said there will be a branch, there will be a twig, there will be somebody that sprouts up. And out of this tiny little place of Nazareth, and what good thing comes out of Nazareth? Like really, nothing good comes out of Nazareth. There's a twig that one day will turn into a branch, and using Jesus' own analogy, it'll be almost like a tree that covers the entire world when his kingdom comes. And he will rule and he will reign with justice and righteousness, and peace will be the word of the day across all his kingdom. But when he came the first time, he was like a twig. This branch was not, full of fruit and this big bough. He was like a twig out of parched soil, no stately form or majesty that might catch our attention, no special appearance that we should want to follow him. Despised and rejected by people. One who experienced pain and was acquainted with illness, and people actually hid their faces from him. He was despised, and we considered him insignificant, nothing. That's how he came the first time. That's how he came. That's how the branch showed up as a twig. But that's not how it's going to happen when he comes back to actually fulfill the prophecy. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 23, we find this word again. Jeremiah chapter 23, in verse 5. I, the Lord, promise that a new time will certainly come. Still looking to the future. This was not Jeremiah's time. It wasn't Zechariah's time. It wasn't even the first coming of Jesus. There's still a time coming in the future. I, the Lord, promise that a new time will certainly come when I will raise up for them a righteous, there it is, branch the descendant of David, and he will rule over them with wisdom and understanding, and will do what is just and right in the land. And under his rule, Judah will enjoy safety and Israel will live in security. This is something that God promised to David. All the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, what we call the Davidic covenant. He said, David, there is a time coming where I will give your people complete peace, never to be bothered again. Yeah, we haven't seen that one yet. We haven't seen Israel in complete peace yet. Judah will enjoy safety. Israel will live in security. And the name he will go by is the Lord has provided us with justice, or the Lord is just, or the Lord is righteous. And so we've got this branch coming. We've got this one coming. And then I think there's a really neat connection. I didn't see this. A couple of commentaries that I was looking at, I saw this. In John chapter 19, Jesus is standing in front of Pilate, right? And Jesus came out in verse 5, John chapter 19, verse 5. Jesus came outside. He's already wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. They've already beaten him. They've already done all of this stuff. And Pilate said to them, I'm going to use the King James Version here because that's how I've got it memorized. Behold the man. Behold the man. That carries a little bit more weight than just, look, here's a man, right? Behold the man. That's probably not how he said it. He probably said, look, here's the man. But that's, behold the man. Look at all the way back in Zechariah. We are actually in Zechariah. Verse 12, chapter 6, verse 12. Then say to him, after the crown has been put on his head, after Joshua the high priest is standing there, you've made the crown of silver and gold, you've put it on his head. What is Zechariah supposed to say? Behold the man. Isn't that awesome? I didn't make that connection. I didn't see that. This is why we have other scholars and teachers and commentaries. Even little things like that. Behold the man. Here is the man who is standing in the place symbolic of the branch. And it's not Joshua who's going to sprout up and build the temple. It is the branch who is going to sprout up and build the temple of the Lord. One day, Jesus is going to rebuild. Jesus is going to build the temple. Now, do I have that? In that day, yep, we've already been there, the day of the Lord. We'll come back to those. Boom. Israel's temples. Israel's temples. Yes, I have a few other slides. Solomon built the first temple. Actually, Moses built a tabernacle. It was a tent. After the pattern that he saw from heaven, Hebrews tells us that there is a temple in heaven. And when Moses was on the mountain, God sort of let him peek into heaven, see the temple that is there, gave him the blueprints, and here's what I want you to build as a copy or as a shadow, Hebrews tells us, of what you saw. Solomon took that tent, turned it into a temple. That's the first temple. That was destroyed during the exiles. Zerubbabel came back, Zerubbabel and Ezra, and they came back and built what we call the second temple. And if you ever hear anybody talking about this, or you read this in your study Bibles or whatever, you'll sometimes hear this period of Zechariah and Ezra, and really all the way up through Jesus, called the Second Temple period. So the Dead Sea Scrolls during the Second Temple period, the 400 years where God is not giving new prophecy, the Second Temple period. Antiochus, who came in as a forerunner or foreshadowing of Antichrist and sacrificed a pig in the temple and all that. It's called the Second Temple period. There's a lot of archaeology and a lot of research is being done on that time period and on that temple. That was that same temple that we're talking about here with Zerubbabel and Zechariah, 500 years later was still standing and was being remodeled by Herod. In fact, King Herod remodeled this thing and really expanded it, it made it big and beautiful to the point where it was still under remodel under Jesus' time. And if you remember, during Passion Week, Jesus and the disciples, the apostles, are leaving Jerusalem, and they're pointing out, oh, doesn't that look nice? Oh, hey, that's new. I haven't seen it. Oh, look at what they've done. Isn't this such a beautiful thing? And Jesus is like, yeah, it's going to be destroyed. And not one stone is going to be left on another. Well, aren't you, the party guy, right? Aren't you so fun, full of great information? And so Herod's remodeling this for like 50 years, leading up to Jesus' time and during Jesus' time. That was destroyed in the year 70. There is no temple standing in Israel right now. And in fact, since Acts chapter 2, the New Testament says that the church is the temple of God. Don't you know that you, plural, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, you, plural, are the temple of God and the Holy Spirit resides in you. The church is the temple of God during this time. Well, at the rapture, the church is going to be removed from the earth. God's attention is going to come back to Israel, in specifically Israel, to bring them back to Him. And a third temple, if there's not another one already built by then, a third temple is going to be built. And it's going to be funded, or at least allowed and permitted, by Antichrist. And the sacrifices will start again. And we're told that in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, in the middle of, sometimes we call it the tribulation, that the Antichrist is going to bring the sacrifices to a stop, to an end. Well, that means they have to start again, right? They're not happening now. They will start up again. Antichrist will put them to the end again. Jesus is going to come back, going to completely punish His enemies, as we see here, judge His enemies. That temple is going to be either destroyed or wiped out or cleansed or something. And now we come to the millennium, the Messianic Kingdom, and there will be a brand new temple and a brand new Jerusalem. And whether that's 4 or 5 or whatever, I really don't care. We're calling it Messiah's temple. And Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, we're talking 9 chapters, the last 9 chapters of Ezekiel. God gives the detail of what the new temple and the new Jerusalem, not the new Jerusalem of Revelation, but the restored Jerusalem, the restored temple will be like in Messiah's kingdom. See, we have all this information. We have all this detail that God gave us. And then after the millennium, after the Messianic kingdom, when we go into eternity, Revelation 22 says there is no temple there. There is no temple because the Lamb Himself will be right there. Jesus Himself. We don't need a temple in eternity. We're not going to need sacrifices. We're not going to need anything because we will have a perfect relationship with God. All at that time, all sin will be removed for all time into eternity, and there's not going to be a temple. There's not going to be nighttime because God Himself is going to be the light forever. This is really cool. See, prophecy is really cool when we put it together and we let it interpret itself. So, here is, I was going to review all of let's do this very quickly. In the first, because this is the summary of the visions. In vision 1, the world is at peace, and we've done this over the past several weeks, so this is not new. The world is at peace, Israel's back home in her land, and the question comes up, God, when are you going to judge the nations that have oppressed Israel? In vision 2, God says, I will do this, but you have to wait on my timing. You have to allow me to do it when I want to. And in fact, I'm going to use some of Israel's oppressors to beat up on some of Israel's other oppressors. I'm going to actually use them because I can do that because I'm God. And so those are the first 2 visions. 3 and 4, in vision 3, we have the surveyor. And in prophecy, when we see a surveyor, it means that God is at work, measuring or whatever, giving some detail. God's attention was turning back to Israel and Jerusalem. In the 4th vision, we have Joshua, who has dirty clothes on, and God gives him a brand new garment, brand new hat, the whole thing, and He cleanses Israel, as symbolized by Joshua there. Israel needs to be cleansed from her sin, purified from her sin, and return to obedience if they're going to gain God's blessings. So we're walking through this They need to be, Israel's returned. The oppressors need to be judged. They're going to be judged. God is turning his attention back to Israel. And one of the first things he's going to do is purify Israel. Vision number 5, we have the menorah and the light and the oil that's coming in. And the oil represents the Holy Spirit. We saw that. And God said, not by strength, not by might, not by power, not by anything that you can do, but by my Spirit, says the Lord, is going to accomplish this, is going to cleanse you, light you, guide you, the whole thing, and anoint them for future service. Vision 6 was the flying scroll with the curse written on it. And it was a reminder that Israel in this time, Zechariah's time, and even up to the cross, they were still under God's law, and they had to obey it if they're going to receive blessings. And that's always been the case. Their obedience led to their blessings. The 7th vision was the woman in the basket that was carried off to Babylon and will actually be set in a temple there and sin. This was the sin that was in Israel at the time, probably idolatry, and it will be worshipped. And we see that happening during the 70th week, during the tribulation period. And then finally, Vision 8 was God's judgment on the nations, where he sent out the chariots to judge the enemies of Israel, to judge his enemies. And Dr. Unger put it this way: this is the usual prophetic order. First the judgments of the day of the Lord, and then the full kingdom blessing. So as we walk through the visions, we end with God finally judging the nations like he said he would way back here in Visions 1 and 2. Finally judging the nations that had oppressed Israel. We haven't seen that happen yet. It's still future. And then the crowning of the king and setting up of the kingdom. That's the order. That's how it's going to happen. And we see that laid out for us here in Zechariah. The crown then was removed from Joshua's head and was placed in the temple as a memorial. And because it wasn't his crown. In verse 14, he was the stand-in. He was the fill-in. They crowned him. The prophecy of the branch is going to do this. All right, we're done. Take the crown off of his head, but put it in this temple. Once the temple is built, put it in the temple as a reminder, as a memorial of what God is going to do. So that it's constantly in your face, that the promise, what God has promised, if you obey him, you will be able to participate in these blessings. And so, we come to that, so what? That's the whole thing. And you're sitting there like, so what? Right? What am I supposed to do with this? It's a great story. I'm glad that it's going to happen and that it did happen or something about happening. So what? What are we supposed to know about this? What are we supposed to do about this? Why should we care about? Why should we study prophecy? 2 things. Number 1, I've said this repeatedly through Zechariah so far. I'm going to keep saying it because this is one of the key things about studying prophecy is that God is trustworthy. God is a God of character, and his character is trustworthy. And here's how we can bring this to us today. Zechariah chapter 6 doesn't have anything to do with us, but there's a principle here. And the principle is, if he has given us, I love calling prophetic prophecy history written in advance. I heard that a long time ago. I will never forget that. Prophetic prophecy, a future prophecy is history written in advance. Just like we cannot go back and change history, it is a done deal. When God says, this I will do, it is a done deal. Can't change it. It's like history written in advance. I love that. And if we can trust him for what he says about the future, can't we trust him for the present as well? If we can trust him, if we can say, oh yeah, I'm sure you're going to do that. I'm sure you're going to take care of all these things that you've laid out in the Old Testament. When he tells us things in the New Testament about how he guides us and leads us, how he comforts us and all of these things, we can trust him for the future. If you've believed in Jesus as your Savior, you trust him for eternity. Right? Why don't we trust him now? Why don't we trust Him for the present, this life? Why don't we dedicate ourselves, get on the path of discipleship? What is holding us back from trusting Him now when we have no problem trusting Him for the future that we can't see, that we're not going to be, we're going to be maybe a part of or not be a part of or whatever? We love the abstract trust. We love having faith in Him for the things that we can't see. What about the stuff right now? Where do we trust Him today? And I think prophecy reminds us of that. We can trust Him to take care of the present as well. And then number two, why should we study and care about prophecy? Because it should affect how we live. It should affect how we think. It should affect how we prioritize our life now. I want to close with these verses here. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 11. Since all of these things, Peter just got done talking about like the end, where God is going to destroy everything. Revelation 21 tells us about that. Since all these things are going to melt away in this manner, what sort of people must we be? Conducting our lives in holiness and godliness, while waiting for and hastening the coming day of God. Because of this day, that future day, the heavens will be burned up and dissolved, and the celestial bodies will melt away in a blaze. But according to His promise, we're awaiting for the new heavens and the new earth, in which righteousness truly will reside, just like we saw in Isaiah. So, why do we study prophecy? Why do we care about prophecy? Because it should affect the way we think. It should affect the way we live. It should affect how we prioritize things. And to use Peter's question, knowing what's coming, knowing history that has been written in advance for us, what kind of people should we be? Or to use Francis Schaeffer's question from about 50 years ago, how should we then live, knowing what we know? Right? That's why we study prophecy. That's why we come to passages and we spend so much time in passages like Zechariah chapter 6 that has no direct application. We don't have to do anything about this. We're not building silver and gold crowns. We're not crowning anyone. What in the world does this have to do with us? It has everything to do with us because we can trust God for the future as well as for the present as well as the future. And because knowing what's coming should affect how we live and think and prioritize now. That's why we study prophecy.